up, all victims of oppression, for the tyrants fear your might. Don't cling so hard to your possessions, for you have nothing if you have no right.
Советская власть есть путь к социализму, найденный массой трудящихся, и потому верный, и потому непобедимый.
Lenin, leader of the Russian Revolution. If Marx laid down the theory of communism, the need for the working class to organise to end its own exploitation, it was Lenin who fashioned a disciplined party capable of seizing power. But Soviet communism collapsed short of its 75th anniversary. After the failed coup 15 months ago, Mikhail Gorbachev came back from the Crimea, strongly rebutting criticism of the party.
Когда вы говорите в целом о партии, как о реакционной силе партии, я с этим...
When you talk about the party as a whole, as being a reactionary force, I do not agree. I know thousands of people, hundreds of people. Some of them are sitting here. People who are real Democrats, devoted to perestroika, devoted to the struggle. And they will neither surrender nor bend.
2 days later, he changed his mind and resigned as party leader. The era ushered in by the Russian Revolution was over. Remaining communists around the world, who had for so long followed Moscow's lead, felt isolated, betrayed, uncertain of their identity. Chris Harney is the leader of the world's fastest-growing communist party in South Africa.
I felt deceived as a person because I had been to the Soviet Union several times. We were not shown the ugly side. And incorrectly, therefore, we went out of our way to justify everything that the Soviet Union did. When they went into Hungary, when they went into Czechoslovakia, we thought it was our communist duty to defend and justify these positions. So for us, this was a blow, this was shattering when there was this collapse. And we had to sit down and review the situation. Was it correct for us to continue? And we said yes, because we said in the basics of Marxism, there was nothing wrong.
Over the past 3/4 of a century, millions have seen communism as a means of achieving a fairer world. Dennis Healey, former British Defence Secretary, spent 3 years in the Communist Party, joining while a student at Oxford.
I think the thing you've got to remember is that the 30s was the period when it seemed as clear to young people that capitalism has failed as it's clear to young people now that communism has failed. We'd seen capitalism produce fascism in Italy, Hitler in Germany, a great recession which had produced mass unemployment all over the world, and there were very, very few people in the chattering classes among intellectuals who thought that capitalism had a future at all.
But communism was almost from the start indelibly linked to the fortunes of one country. That was at times a strength, having a superpower on your side, but an enormous liability too, as the spectre of Stalin loomed. Appalling crimes have been committed in the name of communism, from Stalin's mass purges to the killing fields of Cambodia. Time and again, governments ruling in the name of the people have turned against the people.
28 people are reported to have been shot dead in Peking tonight as armed troops move to clear the protesters in Tiananmen Square. Hundreds are known to have been
indiscriminately, again and again at the crowds, and people were falling around us.
Groups of students, workers and other citizens began singing the socialist anthem that they've also made their own, the Internationale.
The students confronting the Chinese Communist Army sang the worldwide communist anthem, demonstrating the lasting appeal of the ideology and the extent to which it's been distorted. But 75 years ago, communism was unsullied. With the Russian Revolution, a new world beckoned.
I came home from school, and my mother, who was a rather reserved woman, picked me up, said, "Frida, the Russian workers have taken things into their own hands, people like us." And she went on, and she had tears in her eyes. And I thought, oh, That must be wonderful. I don't know what it means, but if my mum's happy, then I'm happy too. Let me tell you this, it was hope.
Frida Brewster's family, poor Croatian immigrants in Pittsburgh, believed communism could bring them dignity. Londoner Harry Young was attracted by the air of adventure, and off he went, bright-eyed, to Moscow in 1922 as a delegate to Comintern, the Communist International.
I'll never forget it, as long as I live. Zinoviev was the president. Said, the next speaker will be Comrade Lenin. Could hear a pin drop. The vast hall, can you imagine? Very quiet. Folded his arm. Not like Trotsky, no gesticulation, no oratory. Like a granddad talking to his wayward kids. And most of them were, including me. I had no more idea than a bull's foot.
Still, Harry spent 7 years in Moscow as an apparatchik of international communism and an eyewitness to the power struggle to succeed Lenin.
We were fed with all this stuff about the monolithic unity of Bolshevism. And all the time in the Politburo, as you know, the struggle was going on. And by this time, the Fifth Congress had already blown the gaff. Stalin had come out in the open and definitely stated the case against Trotsky. Trotsky, fantastic. I've seen Trotsky at the initiation of 10,000 recruits. Trotsky come out on a white horse, gallop up and down, up onto the podium. Das Transfiert Mirovaya Revolution! Long live the world revolution! Das Transfiert Mirovaya Kommununa! He got a beautiful, melodious, high-pitched voice.
Stalin's trial against me is built upon false confessions, extorted by modern inquisitorial methods. There are no crime in history more terrible.
Trotsky called for world revolution. Stalin settled for socialism in one country. Trotsky lost out. He was expelled from the party in 1927. But Tamara Tegezaryan recalls that many faced a fate far worse than losing their party card.
Чем вот период управления страной Сталиным и всей его кампании был ужасен.
What was terrifying about the way Stalin and his group ruled was that everyone, every single adult, was afraid every day that he might be arrested. Though no one felt, I certainly didn't feel any guilt. Still, I feared that at any time they might arrest me. There were arrests in my building and at my workplace. There were so many people disappearing. Among them, many you knew were honest people. And about the most honest were the old Bolsheviks.
Честными людьми были, конечно, старые большевики.
By the mid-30s, the old Bolsheviks had gone, with one exception, and he developed into a notoriously brutal dictator.
We believed in Stalin, like a god, like a god.
Vasily Solodovnikov, later a Soviet diplomat, joined the young communists in the 30s.
Maybe it is a Russian tradition. We need a Tsar or leader, and that's why we believed very much in Stalin. At that time, we didn't know about his real policy. We didn't know how many people he killed and so on, so it was unknown for us, and we believed him.
But communism was also crippled by its failure to expand beyond Soviet borders. The German Revolution Lenin had so confidently predicted never happened. The Comintern became an appendage of Soviet foreign policy. With Hitler on the rise, the German Communist Party found itself shackled to an intensely sectarian Comintern line. Frida Brewster, smuggling money and documents to the underground German party, sensed a tragedy in the making.
On one occasion I got the atmosphere when I had a talk with a German girl, and I said to her, well, Hitler's not getting any weaker, he's getting stronger. Oh no, she said, he won't succeed and the people will come to us. There was a breakaway, I understood, of Social Democrats. I said, together you could stop Hitler. She said, comrade, you're off the line. We'll never agree to this with the social fascists. And that was it, the line. They're our leaders and they know what they're doing, you know. So we defended the indefensible. It frightened hell out of me, to tell you the truth.
And Peter Florin, his father, a founder member of the German party and himself a lifelong communist, agrees that the Comintern had a corrupting impact.
I particularly mean the theory that the Social Democratic Party was, to some extent, the mainstay of German capitalism, and so the main thrust of the class struggle had to be directed against them. That theory, accusing the Social Democrats of being social fascists, was wrong. It obstructed the creation of a united front between communists and social democrats. And that was one reason why Hitler was able to seize power.
The mistake was eventually made good. In 1935, as Dennis Healy recalls, communism abandoned far-left isolationism, cozied up to the centre-left, and became thoroughly respectable.
The watershed in the Communist Party internationally was the Seventh World Congress, and it was, as you say, very sectarian before that. Communists always wore beards, looked dirty, did badly in their examinations. Then when it became Popular Front, which reflected, of course, the desire to create a popular front against the Nazis and fascists, everybody shaved, behaved well in public, and got firsts in their examinations.
The willingness of communist parties to work with others against fascism won them a new following, particularly among intellectuals and the young. Many took up the fight against fascism for real in the Spanish Civil War.
Fighting in the university city of Madrid appears to have gone on more or less all night, and here the government claimed to have gained ground. It is understood that a considerable number of foreign volunteers, probably more than 1,000, have got into Spain during this past week.
The commitment, the sacrifice, was the positive side of communism. The Hitler-Stalin pact represented something much less savoury. The war against fascism was brushed aside as an imperialist conflict. But then, when Hitler's troops turned east, came another abrupt about-turn. Moscow called it a people's war. The undoubted heroism of the Soviet Red Army attracted recruits to communism. In occupied Europe, France, Italy, Greece, Yugoslavia, small parties grew rapidly through their prominence in the anti-fascist resistance. We must banish the barbarity of the Italian fascists and liberate our country. The communist leader Togliatti, broadcasting from Naples in 1944. His longtime companion Nilde Iotti says this experience moulded the Italian party, soon to be the biggest in the West.
Fin dal giorno dopo la fine della guerra di liberazione, noi
From the day the War of Liberation ended, indeed, even before the war was over, we accepted the goal of parliamentary democracy, of a democratic way forward in Italy, the aim of winning people over, consensus politics, if you like. This made us different from other communist parties, who still believed their time would come. In other words, they were still waiting for revolution.
This was the birth of Euro-communism, communist parties coming to terms with parliamentary democracy. But in Eastern Europe, the Red Army succeeded where the Comintern had failed, installing regimes which made communism a byword for intolerance and inefficiency. Elsewhere, communist opposition to imperialism and its appeal as a modernising and secular force had won over small but influential groups in the colonies. Ironically, they were often supervised by the Communist Party in the colonising country. Jyoti Basu, now the Communist Chief Minister of West Bengal in India, was recruited when he came to London to qualify as a barrister.
I was not in politics at all before I went to England. CPGB at that time, they had a section which was trying to contact Indians or Asians or people from Africa and so on to build up groups of communists. And then the Communist Party of Great Britain, it was supporting our independent movement also in India. That is how I became a communist there.
In the late 40s, Indian communists turned to open confrontation, initiating a peasant uprising in Telangana. Anima Das Gupta, then a Calcutta-based communist, was caught up in that mood of militancy.
I was quite young at that time, and I knew many comrades died, many peasants died, and I sang the songs of Telangana regarding those pregnant women who were shut down. We were asked to face the police every day in the street without any arm. Gradually, our nerves become shattered. Every day there used to be bullets, sticks, and it was just like a hide-and-seek game. Once we just asked for the arms, to give us some arms so that we can face the police. So we were called cowards. But
the great success for Asian communism came in China. Yu Xiaotung was recruited into the underground movement just before it captured power.
When I joined the demonstration, then the party come to find me. Oh, you're an activist, and you know something about the revolution. Then they gave some books for me to read, and then I joined the underground organization. At that time in school, at the same classroom, at the same bedroom, you can find a secret agent there. You just don't know your neighbors. Is that our comrade? So you have to keep secret all your activities. But what the communism is, I should confess, I didn't know.
Mao Zedong proclaimed the People's Republic of China from the Gate of Heavenly Peace in Peking in 1949. But the international scene was threatening. Wartime allies had become Cold War enemies. The Soviet Union expected absolute loyalty, which reform-minded Western communists, such as the historian E.P. Thompson, found increasingly unsettling.
Alas, 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 the formula was always, let's look at the Soviet Union, what sort of predicament the Soviet Union is in, and then deduce our policy from that. At the same time, the Cold War was getting underway. And this was a very ugly period. The period of the formation of NATO, the period of the Korean War. On the one hand, one felt because of the Cold War, one had to continue to support the Communist Party. On the other hand, one was aware of its sclerosis, of its incredibly doctrinaire two camps language. Most of us went along with that until the Khrushchev's secret speech, of course.
Khrushchev's sensational revelation of the enormity of Stalin's crimes, the purges, the executions, was made to a closed session of the 1956 Soviet Party Congress. It robbed the communist movement of its remaining credibility. A British communist journalist based in Moscow, Sam Russell, first heard word of it when he casually inquired what had happened at the session.
I ran into a Russian journalist whom I'd got to know, and I asked him what was happening. I said, I suppose it's just the election of the new Central Committee. Well, he said, as a matter of fact, I think not. He said, I believe that Khrushchev made another speech. He crossed the T's and dotted the I's on the question of the cult of personality, the crimes committed by Stalin over his 30 years in power.
Khrushchev's report was read on the meetings of the Communist Party. Most of members like myself, young members and the people who was far from the Moscow, and we didn't know anything about this, so it was a great shock.
The first reaction was this can't be true, and then we realized it was true. It was, of course, a direct contradiction, massive, massive contradiction of a whole 2 decades of Soviet propaganda, and therefore undercut the entire political framework that the Communist Party operated on.
That first shockwave was followed 8 months later by another. Moscow had already seen Belgrade slip out of its sphere of influence. It wasn't prepared to let Budapest go the same way.
This is Hungary calling, the last remaining station, or to the United Nations. Early this morning, the Soviet troops
This was jackboot communism. The Hungarian uprising was brutally suppressed. Whatever their misgivings, communist parties rallied to the Soviet side. Communism became yet more deeply tainted by totalitarianism. 12 years later, another Soviet-led invasion destroyed the pluralist communism of the Prague Spring. This time, the influential Italian party led a storm of communist protest. No one could speak anymore of a monolithic communist movement. The most serious rift, though, had occurred some years earlier. George Matthews represented the British Party at an international communist conference in Moscow in 1960. He says the impending Sino-Soviet split was all too evident.
There were two long tables in the Great Hall of the Kremlin, and the main protagonists sat facing each other, the Russians and the Chinese, on either side. And every time Ponomarov, who was one of the principal Soviet representatives, spoke to someone at either side of him, he put his hand over his mouth so that the Chinese sitting opposite him couldn't lip read what he was saying. I'd never seen that happen before. I mean, maybe it happens quite often in international conferences, but it's the first time I'd ever seen it, and it was extraordinary to see it at an international communist conference.
China promptly veered towards a cult of personality almost as pronounced and almost as tragic as that in the Soviet Union a generation earlier.
Is Radio CT. We begin our program with a quotation from Chairman Mao Zedong.
Make trouble, fail. Make trouble again, fail again, till they do.
People just look at Mao Zedong as a god, you see. Even to the beginning of Cultural Revolution, people just believe in party. I was quite lucky. Like the most of the intellectuals, I was assigned to work in the countryside. And then I was called back to teach foreign language. People were suffering greatly at that time. In the Cultural Revolution, I realized that the Mao makes serious mistake.
Maoism had some international appeal, but it was another Far Eastern party which captured the imagination of a generation.
From the National Liberation Front students in Vietnam.
This was part of a new left, which despised capitalism and conventional communism alike. Tariq Ali was a leader of the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign in Britain.
That image of a poor peasant nation standing up to the might of the world's largest, most powerful industrialized country, the United States of America, brought out the best, I think, in our generation, and people felt that this was wrong, that this was immoral, that this had to be opposed, and so you saw the birth of a movement in solidarity with an oppressed people, and this movement swept the world. This was then tied in with Che Guevara, the Cuban revolutionaries' appeal to create 2-3 mini-Vietnams to try and lessen the pressure on the poor Vietnamese themselves, and we were very inspired by this.
Che Guevara symbolized a cavalier form of communism, a world away from the grey-suited comrades in the Kremlin. The communist journalist Sam Russell travelled to Cuba in the early 60s. A long, late-night interview with Che convinced him that the two styles were incompatible.
Certainly Che Guevara had a very poor opinion of the communists. And he said, "You communists," making it quite clear that he did not consider himself a communist at that time. I said, well, you know, surely the communist parties of Latin America have shown that they are capable of organising and leading revolutionary activity. And he turned to me and he said, "Los partidos comunistas de América Latina son la mierda." The communist parties of Latin America are shit. You couldn't have it straighter than that. That was his view. He gave only 2 countries in Latin America which, in his view, had the possibility of advance to socialism through democratic and parliamentary means. Uruguay and Chile.
Chile represented first hope, then tragedy for international communism.
El pueblo unido jamás será vencido. El pueblo.
Salvador Allende, elected president with communist support, was overthrown by an American-backed military coup.
Le salva el presidente de la República, desde el Palacio de la Moneda.
This is the president speaking from the presidential palace. We have confirmed reports that the Navy has taken control of Valparaíso.
Gladys Marín, now set to be the communist presidential candidate in Chile, was then a prominent young communist.
No me vine al local del partido, me vine al local que ya, imagina, ya está, todas las tropas estaban en la calle, me vine al local del partido.
I went to the party headquarters. You can imagine the situation. Troops already in the streets, and soon after I got to the party offices, the police raided them. I was the last person to speak on Radio Magallanes, our nationwide radio station. I called on the people to defend Allende. I never thought the government was going to be defeated. Then I heard the Politburo was to meet in the building where my husband worked. I got there about 10 or 11 in the morning. That was the last time I ever saw my husband.
The downfall of Allende prompted the Italian party to edge towards sharing power with other parties rather than seeking to supplant them. It didn't work. Eurocommunism faded. Gorbachev's glasnost came too late for the Soviet Union. Opposition movements gained ground in Eastern Europe. It all came to a head towards the end of 1989.
The police commander on duty here at Checkpoint Charlie has suddenly announced that they can go over to the western side of the Berlin Wall.
Thousands gathered to mark the end of communist domination. In the capital, Prague, a huge rally was held in Wenceslas Square.
This is Radio Bucharest. Dictatorship has come to an end in Romania on Friday, December 22nd.
In the developing world, communism had the cachet of anti-colonialism, but was often a cover for corrupt one-party rule. With the Soviet model transparently unsuccessful and Soviet aid ended, ideology lost its attraction. Chedi Jagan, a veteran Marxist, last month elected president of Guyana.
I don't see that they can play much of a role, which they formerly played as the Soviet Union when they gave aid to countries like Cuba and they aided other national liberation struggles like in Mozambique and in Angola. They do not have the means. So the struggle will now be internal rather than the Cold War external struggle.
But there are communist movements still in the fray. In the rest of this series, I'll be looking at 4 communist parties which continue to count for something. Next week, Cuba, then West Bengal, Italy and South Africa.
Marxism, science, is the same thing. And therefore, because there were mistakes in the Soviet Union, because things went wrong in the Soviet Union, it was just that their experiments failed. And in science, experiments fail all the time. You know, I don't think socialism failed. I think the Communist Party of the Soviet Union failed socialism.